Fair trade, you've likely heard of it and perhaps purchased fair trade products, but how does the system actually work? To explain the process in more detail is Erin, who is with the Canadian Fair Trade Network. Erin, welcome to BCN.
Great, thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
Now, most people have probably seen a lot of the packaging in stores labeled fair trade, but I wonder if many of us really know what that actually means. Erin, what is fair trade?
So fair trade is a certification that you will often see on products. There are many different labels, but the Canadian Fair Trade Network endorses a certification that is administered by the Fair Trade International and the Fair Trade Labeling Organization. And it's a very comprehensive label, very robust auditing practices that are taken, and it looks at the actual price that is paid for a product to the producer, as well as the type of working conditions that those producers are employed under, whether there's any child labor in the supply chain, any slavery, modern day slavery. It also looks at environmental standards and makes sure that there are certain minimum standards that are being met to avoid harmful chemicals on the earth. It's also meant to provide benefit to the community. So there's community investment with the international fair trade system. And it's meant to be a long-term relationship with the producer organization so that they can count on that money and and they can actually plan for the future.
So child labor and slave labor, that's very disconcerting. Do we see a lot of that in the 21st century?
You know, you would be surprised. A lot of people don't realize, but there is a lot of modern day slavery even today. A lot of times there are problems with children being put to work, sometimes on behalf of the family who feel very desperate. They need a way to be able to make some money to keep their family going. And oftentimes children get, especially in the chocolate industry, we hear of this often where children get sold into basic slavery conditions in order to try to get some minimum amount of money for the rest of the family. So it is more widespread than people think.
So we have a problem in some countries where workers do not have good working conditions and are not being paid a fair price for their hard work and their products. How common is this right now?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's quite common, and it's really the norm. And you see this when you look at the price of certain items in the store. Like when you take a look at the price of, say, a banana, and you compare it to even the price of a local product, such as an apple, and you can see the disparity there. With all of the amount of cost and even just shipping that type of a fruit, a banana, from another country all the way to Canada, it's really very disparaging to see that the cost is almost cheaper than buying local produce. And so you have to wonder, where in the supply chain are people not being paid? And that's really the crux of what fair trade is trying to address, that there's inequalities in the supply chain, and how can we best address those?
Are there some countries which refuse to work with groups like your own?
Well, being part of the Canadian Fair Trade Network, we are primarily focused with Canadian products that are exported or imported into Canada. The Fair Trade International system, probably there's less reception on some countries to actually get involved in the fair trade system. And so that's why we often don't find maybe products from some of the Middle Eastern countries. A lot of countries that have unrest might be less willing to actually participate in the fair trade system.
So Erin, how do you go about identifying which workers are not getting paid fairly?
To be honest, it's more Fair Trade International does some advocacy work in various countries. The Canadian Fair Trade Network, per se, does most of our work locally here in Canada. But basically, the Fair Trade International waits for producers to come to them. I don't think there's as much of searching for the inequality, but trying to spread the word that fair trade is a system to try and address the disparities that we're seeing in people not being paid a fair price. But those producer organizations have to come voluntarily into the system. There's no coercion or trying to bring people in or searching for that. It's very hard to go into a country and try to uncover where there might be problems. But I think word of mouth from the network and the producers that are involved with the system is more the encouragement that we try to get with getting new producers on board.
And do workers need to apply to receive fair trade help, or do they have to pay anything to be part of it?
Yes, generally the system is that farmers, individual farmers or producers would be part of a cooperative, and then the cooperative would apply to become a part of the fair trade system, and they would pay into the system, but in doing so they would also get the benefits of having a guaranteed minimum price and the premium that goes into community investment.
Yeah, I was going to ask you specifically, let's talk about this premium and where does the money actually go?
So again, with a cooperative, there are representatives that are elected to the board of the cooperative, and they have the power to democratically vote on what sorts of improvements need to be made. So sometimes the premium is spent on just giving bonuses to the workers, going back directly to their families. Other times the investment is more on the business side, so buying new equipment or looking at implementing new processes for the business to improve the business. And then other times it's really about the community, and maybe, daycare is needed for the workers, maybe there is an education system that's needed, maybe even there's just a children's program or a sports program that's needed in the community. So it's really up to the producer cooperatives to decide on how best to spend that money.
Now, there are fair trade standards for the products that's being sold, but is there any way to enforce these standards around the world?
I think that's what Fair Trade International is trying to do, is fill that gap and get enough buy-in that eventually, if this is applied universally worldwide and those minimum standards are always being met, then we wouldn't need the fair trade system at all. However, right now, that buy-in is not there, and a lot of governments don't feel compelled to actually implement those standards in their respective countries. So in trying to just address that, we're trying to say that, Canada at minimum should not be importing products that are not a part of an unjust supply chain.
So, Erin, outside of food, what other categories of products does fair trade really certify?
So there are many different industries. The flowers like roses are another industry. There's also the mining, so anything that goes into electronics. There's a new fair phone that's available in the UK. We're hoping that eventually it will come to Canada, but that's a fair trade phone. There's also cosmetic ingredients, so some composite ingredients such as shea butter or coconut butter. Those can be certified as fair trade as well. And then clothing is another big one. Generally, it's fair trade cotton because fair trade is meant to be a non-GMO product. So right now, cotton is the only fair trade textile that's available.
Does fair trade end up costing the consumer more money?
It depends on the commodity, really. When you look at coffee, which is really one of the first staples that was part of the fair trade system, and it's the most familiar product that people know about as a fair trade product, you won't find a big difference because of economies of scale. Coffee has gotten so popular that the fair trade is, if at all, it might be marginally more expensive, but in general, you can find comparable fair trade coffees to conventional coffees. Same with wines. We find that wine is pretty much the same across the board, whether it's a fair trade wine or a non-fair trade wine. But then there's other products where it might be a slight increase in the price. And really, the fair trade system is meant to try and cut out as many middlemen as possible, put the power back into the producer's hands, and make sure that they're at least getting a fair share of the total cost of the supply chain.
But is the potential still there, Erin, for the retailer to add as much profit margin as they can, on top of the cost of fair trade items? Or do you kind of put some sort of a cap on it?
I think that's specific to the country that's importing the product. Like, I believe there's Canadian laws that have a cap on how much a retailer can mark up a product. That's not to say that some stores or brands might decide to try to, raise the price a bit higher. The one thing though is that a lot of fair trade products are also organic products, so you generally pay a little bit more for organic products, and because fair trade products are organic products, there may be a perception that that increase is due to the fact that they're fair trade when it might be because they're organic and fair trade.
Now, there are also some critics of fair trade. Some studies have found that coffee bean farmers receive only marginally more income than uncertified farmers. One of the issues they say is oversupply. So the more fair trade coffee available, the price may drop. Any thoughts on that?
To be honest, when we've talked with the Canadian Fair Trade Network and Fair Trade Canada, we've found that that's not the case, that there's often not enough demand for fair trade products. And so there's actually a need for more supply. Yeah, basically, oversupply is not an issue right now with fair trade. We're really just looking to build that consumer demand so that we can sell more fair trade products on fair trade terms. Some cooperatives have trouble and they have to sell fair trade products on conventional terms, so they're really losing the benefit.
So when we go shopping, we probably cannot always buy something that's labeled fair trade. In those cases, is there a way to determine whether or not what we're buying is coming from a source that treats workers fairly?
Unfortunately, it does go back to the consumer and doing your research. So I always encourage people to ask the brands that they shop with regularly to be transparent about how they source their materials and be transparent in how their supply chain works. And generally, if a brand or a product is doing a good job of that, they're not scared to share that they're actually proud to show how transparent they can be and to share stories about how they're paying their workers fairly. I think a lot of times when you get limited information from certain brands or you're not getting the information that you want as far as that transparency piece, then it points to a bigger issue.
So tell me about government involvement when it comes to fair trade. How does that work?
So there is some legislation that's going on in Canada around trying to protect against child labor being in the supply chain, as well as modern day slavery. There was an act that was put forward. I'm not an economist or a politician, so I don't know a whole lot about it, but I do know that there's still more that can be done by the government to really protect that we don't have issues of slavery or child labor in our supply systems. And another big one is human trafficking, which it's all really related. So I think the government is trying to take some small steps. I think as citizens, we need to push our government to take bigger steps to really make sure we're avoiding those problems in our supply chains and are treating people fairly universally.
So which countries, in your experience, Erin, have been some of the worst violators when it comes to the human trafficking and child labor or even slavery?
Well, I mean, I was very involved in the latest Fashion Revolution Week back in April, and that's really commemorating the Rana Plaza collapse in Bangladesh. I mean, clothing is a huge problem where we're seeing that a lot of Asian countries are being pushed to produce clothing for us at under poverty rates, and it's not fair, and it's definitely something that governments aren't protecting their people from. And so that's where our government needs to take a stand and say we don't want any of that type of low standards or human rights violations coming. We're not supportive of that in our environment, in our culture.
So has Ottawa actually sided with you saying we're looking into this and we're going to stand up for you and make sure that most products are fair trade?
I believe there is some general support, but I don't think there was any ratified legislation actually requiring companies to disclose where they might be complicit with human trafficking or child labor or modern day slavery.
Do you have any idea what percentage of consumer products sold in Canada are in fact fair trade? Do you have some numbers?
Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get those statistics. It is quite a low number. We do know, however, that products such as fair trade coffee are growing at an increasing rate compared to conventional coffee. For instance, I think the figure was that sustainable brands and fair trade brands are growing at 5 times the rate of conventional brands. So it's obviously something that people are looking for. They want some assurance that their product is sustainable and ethical and is not putting anybody else in precarious situations.
Erin Bird is with the Canadian Fair Trade Network. Thanks a lot for joining me today via Skype from Calgary.
Thank you.